Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of A Story Always, in which we have the great pleasure of having with us Becky Annison. How are you, Becky?
Hello, I'm really good, and thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for being here today. For those of you who don't know Becky, she is one of the admirals of the Black Armada independent RPG publishing company, Ahoy. Uh, and she has written content for games such as Itras By or Trail of Cthulhu, and she's the designer of When the Dark is Gone, which you can find in the Seven Wonders collections, and the co-designer of Lovecraftesque. And she is currently in the process of kickstarting her most recent game, Bite Me, which is the one we'll be mainly talking about today. So, to begin with, why don't you give us a quick pitch about for Bite Me? Well, I send the links on the chat.
So, Bite Me is my game of werewolf pack dynamics, and this game is built out of several different influences. There's a lot of books and television in there because I'm hugely influenced by books in my game design. And the books are the sort of the urban supernatural werewolf novels by Kelly Armstrong, Patricia Briggs. So quite a kind of a modern take on werewolves as opposed to the really traditional stories, but a modern take which really foregrounds pack relationships, which is really interesting to me. It's also influenced by Teen Wolf, the TV show, which I love, which again has a lot of pack stuff in it. And in terms of games, I think that I have joked to people, and this is a joke, but I used to say that the only problem with Monster Hearts was that you were allowed to play something other than a werewolf in it. But that said, it's not about teenagers, it's about adults in a werewolf pack struggling with themes of dominance and control, and also, I think, struggling with messy relationships, because this is a game which is about messy relationships in a close family setting. And part of what is being drawn out here is encouraging people to really lean into those relationships in the system.
And before I continue, I want to remind people that if they have any questions for Becky through the interview, feel free to write it on the chat, and I'll do my best to try to bring them to her. Being said that, so where did the idea for Bite Me came from? Where did you and where did your love for werewolves came from?
I think I've always loved werewolves. I think they've always been my favourite of the kind of the monstrous creatures that we tend to play in role-playing games. Because we do, don't we? I mean, in role-playing games, we've got vampires, wraiths, ghosts, kind of, if you're playing Changeling the Lost, the Fae can start getting pretty monstrous. But werewolves have always been my favourite. And I think it is because there's this pack dynamic that the others don't have so much of. I mean, yes, you might have coteries or vampire clans, but there is an idea of a werewolf pack, which means that although you are a monster and you're struggling with this monstrous part of you, you're doing it as a part of a group of people who, in theory, have your back. And I think that's what's so attractive to me about it, is that you are struggling with the monster, but you're never doing it alone, and you're doing it in a context and in a relationship with people who you might have difficulties in those relationships, but they ultimately understand who you are and where you're coming from. And I think that's what I've always loved most about werewolves. And I think the idea for writing Bite Me really came the first time I read Bitten, which is Kelly Armstrong's debut novel about werewolves. And I read that novel and I sort of said to myself, as I always do, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who does this, gosh, I wish I could just play in that world. Every time my response when I meet a TV show that I love or a book that I love is, how could I get that feeling in a role-playing game? And instead of having that feeling for half an hour a week, I could have it for 4 hours a week.
And I guess the werewolves and the pack dynamics are very rich setting for role playing games where those kind of the party and the group going doing things together is kind of like a fundamental thing of in many role playing games.
Yeah, I think so. I think that we like to play in parties as role playing games. One of the things that D&D does so well, which I think that became a little bit of a stumbling block for me when I played World of Darkness games, was that in D&D you are a party. You're going off to do a thing together, and then when you meet World of Darkness, and then you have someone playing, oh, I want to be a Nosferatu. Okay, well, I'm going to play a Setite, and then somebody else is going to play a La Sombra, and it's like, well, you've got to have a really compelling reason for these people from these very, very different political backgrounds to work together. But ultimately, let's not forget that we're 4 or 5 friends around a table, and whilst it's nice for everybody to have some cool one-on-one time with the GM and with the NPCs, actually, we don't have a lot of time to do that, and I definitely don't have time to do that in the sessions I get to play in these days, because I'm very busy. And so having something where you have a pre-built party and everybody knows they're there to act as a family and act as a party it dovetails quite neatly with the play culture of what we're all sitting around the table to do.
And I guess there may be some interesting interactions between the real world relationships among players and the relationships that form in the game. I don't know if you've seen some of that.
I think that what I wanted to do when I built Bite Me partly was to say that, hang on a minute, we are all sitting here at the table together. We've decided to spend the next 4 or 5 hours in each other's company. That is in itself an established cultural dynamic, even at a very low level, even at a room full of strangers at a convention. That's an established cultural dynamic. We've decided to sit down at this table and do this thing together. And what I've spoken about before is sort of saying, one of the things I find so unusual and so strange about the way people talk about role playing who don't do it is they talk about this like it's a really socially isolated hobby, whereas actually there is nothing else I do in my life other than work where I would voluntarily sit down with 5 strangers for 4 hours and talk to them. There is nothing else that I would do that has the level of kind of intensity of conversation that you might have with a group of people, particularly with a group of strangers that you're meeting at a convention. So I think that recognizing that we come to role-playing with that already set up at the table, I think if you then have a game which kind of feeds into that and leverages it and say, okay, well, we are all sitting here to create this story together. Let's do it as a pack. Let's get that sense of camaraderie going, because as well as I do, when you're in a game and it's going really well and you get that kind of buzz back and forth between everybody at the table and you do get a sense of camaraderie. And so this is a game which says, well, let's try and find out what we're doing which makes that happen and then crank it up to 11.
So how does the game does precisely that? How does it build some relationships among the players, and how does the system kind of fulfill that objective for you?
I think there's a few things. So firstly, when you create the game, when you set the game up, this is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, and in common with many Powered by the Apocalypse games out there is a world building phase. Part of what's important about the world building phase in Bite Me is that you build your pack. So the pack gets its own playbook. You define your culture. So what are the expressions of culture that you have that kind of signify who's in the pack and who's not? Because that's one of the things that we do as humans to signify who's in our social group and who's not. We have these kind of cultural signifiers. So you choose some cultural signifiers, and then every time you use those in play, you get XP. So that gets people incentivized to use it. And then what I have found, having run this game a lot, is that once people have done it a few times to tick their XP, they start doing it automatically without thinking about it. They start using some shared slang. They start building in some things into their description, and it becomes this kind of seamless transition between the gaming group and the characters and back and forth, which is nice. That culture, that cultural creation expression starts to build a sense of camaraderie both in and out of character, which is very important. Then we set up some messy relationships. So in the world building phase, we'll also have a situation where there's some juicy questions on the character sheets, which sets up some messy, slightly antagonistic relationships. And what I say to people is that there is absolutely a player versus player element to this game. But, and this is important, it's not like that time you played in a D&D game where the thief decided to backstab everybody and run off with the loot and you never saw them again. And you left the session feeling like, oh, well, so-and-so just won this game and the rest of us feel like we had a pretty crap session. It's not like that. This is a game where you might dominate each other, or you might fight each other, or you might challenge each other. But ultimately, you're still a family, and you've still got to work together. And so you will do these player versus player things to each other, and then you have to find a way to live with it afterwards. And part of what the GM's role is to force wedges into the relationships in the pack. So you've got messy relationships, you've got these player versus player moves. So half the time the MC is going to be taking those wedges and driving them into the pack to force people apart. And then what they will be doing is they will be taking the external threats which have been created in that world building phase and then using werewolf hunters or a rival pack or something else to really harry the players and drive them back together, because they will survive when they work as a pack. And the game is this sort of dance, if you like, between highlighting difficult and messy relationships and putting pressure on them and taking them to a cracking point, and then pulling back as MC and driving hard with the external threats and really reminding everybody why they are a pack.
And how does the system kind of encourages this aspect of the characters needing each other in the end, even if there's all these other things that are trying to drive them apart? How does the system make them realize that they have to come together? How is that opposing force?
There's two things, and it partly comes down to these spill and provoke spill moves.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the ways that you power up your group is by spilling your emotions, or provoking somebody else to spill their emotions. So you have these messy relationships that the GM is pressing on really, really hard. And they might be somebody in the pack who's betrayed you, or somebody who you have an unrequited love for, or something like that. And things are getting really tight. If you spill how you feel and show your vulnerable emotions to another packmate, then you get points. And points go into this special pool, and you can spend that pool of points on two things, which is assisting somebody and which is spending them on pack moves, which are, winning moves, basically. Really, really powerful. Pack comes together at the last and defeats their enemies and overwhelms them, but it costs you a lot. And to get to that point, you have to have done a lot of clearing the air and sharing your emotions, and that sort of catharsis that comes from letting all the secrets out and really shouting at somebody you're angry at, or confessing your love for somebody. And so when you've kind of shared those emotional moments, there's a kind of a clearing of there's a kind of a catharsis and a clearing of the emotions, and then you've built up all of these points so that, at the last, when the MC drives you into a corner and is about to have you all eviscerated by hunters, you can pull it back. So.
Nice. Where did the idea for those moves came from? What was kind of the need or that you were trying to fulfill? Because I found it really interesting that having moves that are like deal with your feelings.
So there's two things. I think that this is partly an extension of the game design that I did in When the Dark Is Gone. Mm-hmm. So When the Dark Is Gone is about people in a therapy session, but it's really a stealth LARP. There is very little player-facing system in it, and it's a lot about talking about your emotions because you're in a therapy session. And I wanted to go from there and say, taking it out of effectively a free-form LARP concept, mm-hmm. and moving it into something like Powered by the Apocalypse, which is a really, really good design space for that sort of thing. It doesn't sound like it would be, but it is. And the reason it is that the way that you can set up playbooks, the way that you can set up moves, means that you can laser focus your system, mm-hmm. on small individual things you want the players to be able to do, because if you make a move for it, players are going to be doing it in session. And I said, well, hang on, why wouldn't we make moves for people to spill their emotions? Because for me, a really important part of the werewolf pack genre that I'm looking at is to say, well, hang on, what would it be like living in this intense group of individuals who you have these intense ties with? What would it be like to do that if actually somebody can smell when you're afraid? And if somebody can tell from your body language that you're angry about something? What if, because wolves are so much, because werewolves are so much closer to their emotions and their instincts because of the wolfish nature, what if they just didn't care about being stoic and hiding their feelings and not talking about how they felt? And what if there was no point to it because everybody could tell anybody? Hey, we'll move that into, let's make it easy for players to have those emotional interactions in character by putting moves on it and saying, and if you do the moves, you get these points, which means you get to be a really powerful werewolf pack. And the rationale is that if you share your emotions, everybody knows each other better. You can fight more effectively as a team because there's nothing hidden anymore.
Yeah. And I think it's really, really wonderful to break that trope of the stoic character who isn't faced by anything and basically drops a single tear once in the TV show, and that's about it. And the other interesting thing is that it's not just you processing your feelings. There's a move to provoke a spill on someone else to make them deal with their feelings. Why did you feel that was important to have?
I felt it was important, and this again, I suppose, comes down to the way that PbtA allows you to design quite minutely in terms of your moves sometimes. I knew I wanted people to be able to talk about their emotions, but I also wanted to have those scenes where if you're watching a TV show, you're reading a book, and everybody knows that there is a secret that somebody is carrying. We, the audience, know there is a secret that somebody is carrying. And there is just something really delicious about the anticipation of watching another character needle them until the point at which they reveal it. And so I wanted to have the mechanism not for just having the conversation, but for somebody else saying, I want you to have this conversation. It is important to me that you feel you can talk about this. And not only that you feel you can, but I'm going to make you talk about it. It is not enough. So that was the thing for me. It wasn't enough that people could talk about their emotions. I wanted other people to have the ability to make them talk about it.
And it's interesting the way that allows other people to kind of regulate the pacing of someone else's character development.
I think it also feeds into that. Sometimes you just want somebody to ask you. Do you know what I mean? Like, sometimes I think in order for the floodgates to really open, you want to feel like somebody cares enough to needle you and to press you into telling you what's wrong,
And that kind of fixes the problem of having to randomly look at the camera to start your speech.
Exactly.
So another important aspect of the game and the pack dynamics is the hierarchies inside the pact. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about them and how does the game use them to create tension and conflict among the group.
So it was really it was a really important decision I made about whether or not to allow a dominate mechanic. So I played a lot of World of Darkness in the 90s. I'm a 90s child. I played a lot of World of Darkness, and Vampire, absolutely, there's dominate mechanics. And there's a lot of discussion about are they a good thing? Taking away somebody's character agency.
Like, literally the first session I ever ran of Vampire, we had that issue come out. Like, we had a big we got mad at each other because of that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And it is it can be maddening to have your character agency taken away like that. And so it was a design decision I approached really deliberately. But I thought to myself, there's two things going on. Firstly, I think that this sort of goes back to what I was saying about the person in the D&D game who plays the thief and steals the party's stuff and then runs off laughing into the sunset and feels like they have somehow beaten the rest of their friends around the table, and feeling like it was important to me that there was a dominate mechanic in there, but that when it was triggered, it didn't feel like that. And so what I say, and how the dominate mechanic works, and the reason I want a dominate mechanic in there is exactly for the reason you bring up, because it creates a lot of tension and a lot of drama. Having that mechanic in there immediately creates story. And one of the things that was really interesting to me in the early playtests was how much the modern audience didn't want to use it, but they kept getting tempted to do it anyway. And they really, really didn't want to, because dominating somebody else feels like such an awful thing to do, but it was just a really tempting move. And I sort of liked that kind of sense of temptation there. But anyway, so I wanted a dominate mechanic because it leads to these really juicy tensions. But what I say is that deliberately pairing it with spill and provoke spill. And the guidance I give in the text is, when you're dominated, you don't become mindless. You have an instinct inside you to obey, and you do the thing. But you don't have to like it. In fact, you shouldn't. If you have been dominated to do something, go ahead and do it. Maybe you'll feel guilty that you didn't resist. Well, spill about that and get some pack pull points. Maybe you just want to rail on the person who made you do it 3 days later. Store that up, rail on them, get your spill out, get your pack points out. So pairing it with spill and provoke spill, it was very much this kind of catharsis feedback loop. Because one of the things I think is really important is, if you're going to have mechanics in there about spilling your emotions, you have to have difficult things happen in the game for people to spill about. So we will set up some juicy relationships, which gives you kind of like a head start on those spill conversations. But 4 sessions in, you want to be having spill conversations about the fact in session 2 you were dominated to do something you didn't want to do. Do you see what I mean? So that's part of the feedback loop. And what I say to people as well is, it's supposed to feel uncomfortable. The dominate mechanic is supposed to feel uncomfortable. I want you to lean into that feeling. Use that to fuel your role playing. You don't have to like it. But I think in role playing, what doesn't happen in that D&D scenario where the thief has stolen your stuff and run off, is the thing that you don't get to do is to confront them and say, you were my friend, why did you betray me? And to have it out. And so what's different in Bite Me is that the spill and provoke spill are all about getting that kind of emotional closure from these harder moves, if you like.
I guess part of having this pack is that it acts as a closed environment where these kind of things you cannot just like you say run off and there's no resolution. So in a way, the game becomes partly about dealing with all these things, horrible things that happen to you, and trying to resolve it because you have to, because you cannot just run away from them. Which is quite interesting.
Exactly.
And it speaks a lot about this kind of family dynamics. Another part of that is the fact that there's in the game there's an alpha, there's the position of someone else who is above everyone else. So what role do you think does that have in the game? What does that mean, and what does it imply?
So there's a few things about the alpha, and I wouldn't say they're above everybody else exactly. I think that's an interpretation that we bring to it, and it's certainly an interpretation you can play with if you want to, which is an interesting one. And the addition of the alpha has been a little bit controversial, I think, because a lot of people say, well, wolf packs don't have alphas.
Yeah, that's a myth.
And that sort of thing. Which is true. In the wild, they don't have alphas, but werewolves and the werewolf genre, is quite well established now. Werewolves have alphas, and the reason that I wanted alphas in there is because, like Dominate, they create real interesting tensions. So you have somebody who there's a couple of things about the alpha. So firstly, the other packmates can't dominate the alpha.
Mm.
If you want to dominate the alpha, you have to instead make a challenge. Make a challenge is a move that wouldn't get used very often, I wouldn't expect, because the consequences of a miss are really severe for your character and for the pack. But if you do challenge on a 10 plus, which in PbtA is a strong hit. Sorry, I don't know how familiar people are with PbtA, but you have strong hit, weak hit, miss. If you miss, something horrendous will happen. If you have a weak hit, you'll succeed, but with consequences. And if you have a strong hit on Challenge the Alpha, you get to take the Alpha playbook off the player or off the NPC. But other than that, you can't dominate them, unless some skins have got some particular quirks around that, but generally not. So that's the first thing. The alpha can't be dominated in the same way that everyone else can. But if you look at a lot of the alpha's moves, they don't have any extra powers to dominate people.
Mm-hmm.
But what they do have is a lot of support moves. So they have moves whereby if you praise somebody up, you can give them +1 forward and things like that. And it's really kind of drawing out the idea that a pack with an alpha is a pack that is cohesive, they're all going in the same direction, and they have this extra support available to them. So you can totally play this game with no PC alpha, and some of the scenarios that I run for Bite Me don't have a PC alpha, and that's deliberate. And it starts with quite a fragmented pack, and then they have to work out amongst themselves what they're going to do about that. But yeah, so actually in some ways it disadvantages the pack as a whole, because the alpha playbook has so many support moves that they can use to bolster other people. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. But like you say, the concept of the alpha is rooted quite deeply, I think, in our cultural psyche as role players or people who like werewolf fiction. It pulls on something. There's a familiarity there, an expectation there, which is very interesting to play with. How do you feel about the fact that the alpha will tell you to do stuff? It plays back into that dominate mechanic again. How do you feel about the fact that there is somebody who is in charge, and how do they behave? Because that's one of the things that I always say to the people who's playing the alpha. Think very carefully about the sort of alpha you're going to be, because that is going to say what sort of pack this is. Mm-hmm. Are you somebody who rules through fear? Are all the players okay with that in the character creation setup? This is going to be a pack that is ruled along fear and violence, and then everybody can opt in or say that they would prefer it as something else. Or are you a pack leader who is just loved and people respect and love you, and that's how it works? And I think that you can, by having the alpha in there, you can do so many interesting things with the internal dynamics of the pack. It would be a shame to kind of leave that out for the for the reality of egalitarian real world wolf packs, which don't have as an interesting dynamic to them.
And kind of related to all these power dynamics we're talking about is the presence of violence and how it affects the pact, and how it colors every interaction they have. So how do you handle violence in the game?
Well, this is absolutely a game with violence in it, and ultra violence potentially if the players are on board with it. And there is quite a large section on safety mechanics in this game, for not just because of the violence, because of the dominate and things like that. So there is a big section on safety mechanics, and really the first thing is getting everybody around the table to buy in to the level that they are comfortable with. And I routinely play in games where we always agree a list of topics up front that are not on the table, and torture is often on there for obvious reasons, so people can really calibrate it in that way. But I think that violence, again, is a really, really important theme in werewolf fiction. How it gets treated in this game is in a number of ways. So there is only one violence mechanic in the game, if you don't count dominate, which could, in theory, be a form of violence. But if we're talking strictly physical violence, there's only one violence mechanic called mauling. If you take things too far, other people will get ties on you. So what a tie is a little bit like hex, sort of, in Apocalypse World. So having messy relationships with people means that they can have ties on you, and what that means is that they have some sort of emotional lever on you. They know something about you, or you feel guilty about something to do with them, or you are in love with them, or there's something which they could pull on in a conversation, which would destabilize you or might throw you off. So ties are used exclusively. They're spent 1-for-1 to boost rolls exclusively on player versus player rolls. So if you want to dominate another character, if you want to do physical violence to another character, you can do it, and you can spend your ties to make your roll better. If you do something incredibly violent and you roll a miss, then somebody who either saw it or who comes to hear about it afterwards gets a tie on you because they are disgusted with what you did, and the fact they are disgusted matters to you as a player, or sorry, as a player character. So that's one of the things. But again, it always comes back round to spill and provoke spill. Somebody's gone too far with their role, with what's happened in the action. A PC's gone too far with what's happened in the action. Then, 2 days later, I am expecting somebody to say, right, I'm going to provoke spill on you, and you're going to tell me how guilty you feel, or I'm going to spill on you and tell you how disgusted I am and how angry I am at what you've done. And again, it's sort of what Bite Me does is it says that all of these things, this dominating, this violence, it's all in this game, but none of it is just accepted. All of it is fuel for us talking to each other. And any time you want to get some extra pack pool points, you pull somebody up on the awful violent thing they did that you weren't cool with, and it's kind of dancing that line between saying there's some really hard stuff in this game and it's there, and we're going to talk about it, because you don't get to just walk away and walk off into the sunset and it's all kind of cool and no one's going to call you on it, because they are.
Yeah, it ties into this idea of everything in the game, all your actions kind of feeding back on the pack, all the other relationships and everything kind of spilling into each other, into all these other elements. I think I started to see that's kind of like the main thrust of the different game mechanics, of kind of push each other and kind of keep this cycle going.
Exactly right. It's all about keeping the cycle going. So you can't have your emotional conversations without things to talk about. So your dominate, your mauling move, your challenge the alpha move, some of the skin moves, all that does is give you fuel for those conversations.
Another important part of werewolf fiction is usually the theme of loss of control, usually related to the transformation, but also the transformation sometimes it has elements of empowerment, and usually a combination of both empowerment, loss of control, and all that. How does Bite Me handle this kind of stuff?
So there is a move called Give In to the Wolf. It's an optional move. It's a basic move that anyone can do. If you, going back to the strong hit, weak hit, miss, if you get a strong hit on Give In to the Wolf, you get to choose, I think, 2 out of a list of disgustingly powerful power-ups, extra armor. You can swap stats around. It allows you to take some of your stats and add them to your fighting stats if you choose that option. So Give In to the Wolf, if you get a weak hit, then you get to choose one of those things, like doing extra damage or whatever, and if you get a miss, the MC will take control of your character for the next scene, and they will make a hard move with your character. And again, this is kind of coming back to that conversation I was having with you earlier about Dominate. I had spent a long time thinking about how I would model this in the game and what would be okay to model in the game around this, because like Dominate, this is removing character agency. But the cornerstone of werewolf mythology is the fear of loss of agency. So to not have it in the game at all would be it would just feel like it was missing out such a fundamental lodestone of such a fundamental part of the genre that it wouldn't feel like the game that I wanted it to be. But making it into a move which has this temptation that if you make this move, you'll become really powerful. And of course, you're going to want to make that move when the pack's back is against the wall to protect your pack mates. So the temptation to do it to protect those you love is going to be really, really strong, and that's deliberate. Temptation is an important theme in the game. But ultimately, it is your choice whether or not you make the move. So there is not the same complete loss of agency, because you as the player can always choose never to. As a player, you can play this game never making the give in to the wolf move, not once, and you will still have a good time. I promise you. So it is your choice to make the move. But if you get it wrong, there will be bad consequences. Your character will lose control and something bad will happen. Something really bad. You'll probably kill somebody important. You might attack a pack mate. You will do something horrible. And then you can feel bad about it. And then you can feel guilty and you can spill about it, or somebody else can call you on the terrible thing that you did. And so the cycle goes on.
Yeah, I started to see really the central position of the spirit moves, how they kind of close the circuit of the game dynamics. Right?
There's a loop there, a very deliberate loop, and the reason that I feel I can have things like a total loss of character control and dominate and the violent mechanics is because you don't get away with it. It always comes back round to, and now we can talk about it.
It's really cool.
Thank you.
And another aspect that I've been seeing about all of this is that many of these elements, be it the dominate mechanic, the way balance works, the way you can lose control, part of their power is not just that you can use them. Well, it's not that they are as important not for what they do, but just being present. The threat of violence, of domination, the constantly knowing that someone else can dominate you. That I think that really hammers down this kind of. That's really where the hierarchies and relationships are come ahead.
It's not just that you can. It's not just that the moves are there and they will be used. It's that the moves are there and they might be used, or they might not be used, or I think the best moment for me is when somebody has been steadfastly refusing to use one of those moves because their character doesn't believe in it, which is absolutely cool. And then they're in a situation where if they don't do it, if they don't dominate, or they don't give in to the wolf, a beloved pack member is going to die, or something awful is going to happen, and it will be on their head because they didn't do that thing. And I think that sets up a really nice tension for people to play into.
And also colors the relationships because you know that there's always that threat of violence presence whenever you interact with anyone. Violence both physically and otherwise.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the reason PbtA was such a great fit, because it really makes those things present at all moments. It puts them really in front of you.
PbtA gives you this fantastic framework to identify how a loop that you want in the game, and then to kind of build a system which makes it happen. And because of the PbtA's sort of the system of moves, like I said, you can really laser focus your moves onto some really, really specific things that you want the game to feel like. And that's kind of one of the advantages of the system. The other reason I picked PbtA actually is because the first few times I played Apocalypse World, I noticed how the moves had this really beautiful tendency to kind of cascade everything out of control. Like I know that some of the MCing guidance, I think, in Apocalypse World talks about how there's no status quo, everything's constantly shifting. And when you play, you really do get a sense of that, because the moves will trigger moves, and moves will start cascading really quickly. And I felt like in a werewolf game, in a world where control is such a ever-present issue in your life, and violence is such an ever-present issue in your life, having a system which allows you to do this cascade out of control, it's a really nice, as a player, you're sitting there and you're feeling that system and the moves cascade out of control in the same way your character would be experiencing a sense of loss of control or concerns around that because they're a werewolf.
So you talked a little bit about the alpha playbook. Could you tell us a little bit more about the other playbooks and kind of what they are about and what are you excited about them?
Sure. So all of the playbooks that I picked are things that I have when I've read werewolf novels or I've seen werewolf TV shows and films. They're kind of roles that I've seen people taking in the pack, sort of social roles to a certain extent. And there's a couple that I made up myself. But so the alpha is pretty self-explanatory. There's a playbook called the Enforcer. Often in werewolf fiction, there will be somebody who the alpha gets to do their dirty work. Somebody who the alpha maybe has on a leash. Somebody who gets their hands bloody so the alpha can be that one step remove. And I've talked about this before, but it's a really important part of the build of the Enforcer playbook that's actually based on one tiny scene in Buffy. I hope I'm not spoiling anybody. I think it's season 4 of Buffy. Oh, am I okay? Are we okay?
It's been around for a while.
It's been around for a while.
I guess spoilers for Buffy people if you somehow haven't seen it.
There's a scene in season 4 of Buffy which really had a massive impact on me when I first saw it. And I was quite young because Buffy came out when I was 16, 17, I think. And there's a scene in season 4 where the big bad guy is called Glory, and Glory is a goddess half the time, an absolutely, completely powerful, can't be defeated goddess. And the other half of the time, they are a medic called Ben. I seem to recall. Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
And Ben is a completely normal human being. And actually, Ben's quite a nice human being. And he's a medic because he wants to help people. And he's a really lovely guy. And he has no memory and no knowledge of Glory, really. But they can't defeat Glory, and she is just ripping through the world. And there's just this really poignant bit right at the end of the season where Glory turns into Ben suddenly in front of Giles, and Giles smothers him. And somebody sees him do it, and he says to them, "I did it so that Buffy doesn't have to live with the guilt of it." And I felt that's always stayed with me because it's a long time ago since I saw it. And when I was building the Enforcer playbook, it was really important to me to build it on that. This is somebody who, they're not just very violent, although they are a violent character. They are a violent character who bears the burden of guilt for the pack. What they do for the pack is not the violence, it's carrying the guilt of it. And I think that's really important because if you're going to have a lot of violence in games, I think it's important to have that counterpoint and say, well, how does that change somebody? What does that do to them? And the Enforcer is somebody who has a lot of guilt. So that's the Enforcer. Then you have the Cub. The Cub is a playbook for people who want to play somebody who is a new werewolf, not a child necessarily. They're an adult person who has probably only been a werewolf for about a year, maybe less. They've maybe only changed a few times. And it's a playbook about trying to find your pace in this family, trying to work out the sort of werewolf you're going to be. And you have a lot of moves that give you free passes or get people to come and get you out of trouble and that sort of thing. So it's one of the softer playbooks, if you like. There plays a playbook called the Fixer, because you've always got to have a fixer. Werewolves, there's probably going to be a lot of dead bodies lying around. The Fixer is somebody who cleans up the bodies, who finds information. But their social role in the pack is somebody who's very torn between human world and wolf world. They like the human world. They understand it. They can really get their teeth into it. And humans like them. And so they're a character who's living in between two worlds and feels the pull of that. And they're the intermediary. The pack, other than the Fixer, the pack can't deal with humans other than by dominating them or killing them. They look to the Fixer to change that, which means the Fixer has to deal with humans, but it's tearing them up on the inside. There's a character called the Prodigal. The Prodigal is a werewolf who has been out of the pack for some time, and when the game starts, they are just returned.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that does a lot of really interesting things. It says, well, what was my history with the pack, and what is it now? Who is happy that I'm back? Who is resentful of the fact I am back? Who am I avoiding now that I'm back? It's a character with a lot of angst, a lot of juicy drama and history in it. You have the option of choosing extra messy relationships on top of the ones you would normally get. And it's about somebody finding their place again. Which I love the Prodigal. I know that one isn't supposed to have a favourite child, but my favourite child is the Prodigal.
A player picked that when I ran the game, and I think they were the son of the alpha, and they just came back like, and they were like, yeah, I don't want to take over, but everyone was like, you really want to take over. They're like, we don't believe you.
There's so much fantastic drama in somebody who's been away and coming back, and how they might have changed. So that's the Prodigal. So I'm up to Alpha, Enforcer, Cub, Prodigal, Fixer. So two more.
The old person, the person with experience.
So there's a skin called the Grey Pelt.
Yeah.
So the Grey Pelt is somebody who is the oldest wolf. They have moves around knowing all the history and the lore of the pack. So if you're somebody who kind of wants to invent a lot of history for the pack on the fly, who the MC can ask a lot of interesting questions, who did you have a rivalry 10 years ago, and all that sort of stuff. There's somebody with a long past. They have betrayed people, they've done things, so they come with a lot of baggage, but they also come with a question, and the question is, why aren't you the alpha? You're the Grey Pelt, you're the oldest and wisest of us all, you're the most senior wolf in this pack, why aren't you in charge of it? And in answering that question, there's a lot of interesting drama to pull out. They're often a character which is played as a bit of a kingmaker, or as a bit more of a manipulator, as sort of the person who kind of shuffles chess pieces around in the background. And what I would say to people, if you're playing in a game with the Grey Pelt, is you will have the most fun out of it if you lean into their manipulations. Don't try and avoid it. Don't try and kind of, imagine you're in this game of chess and trying to beat them. The fun drama is in being manipulated, feeling annoyed about it, and then spilling about it afterwards. That's where the fun is. And then the last one, which is a character that I wanted to bring in, which isn't something I've seen a lot of in werewolf fiction, but it's a character called the Howl. And the Howl, I think, it wasn't one of the first characters I created, but it's been a really, really popular one since I put it out there. And they are the sort of the spiritual guide for the pack. So where the alpha is looking after the bodies of the physical forms of the pack, this is somebody who shepherds your spirit, and they have rituals around drinking the blood of the dead to find out information about how that person died. If you consume the flesh of a willing packmate, you can do prophecies which give them +1 ongoing, boost their rolls and things like that. But they do things which are very visceral but on a very sort of spiritual level. And what I imagined, talking before about the inspiration of Giles, for the Enforcer, the inspiration for the Howl actually comes from the relationship between Magneto and Professor X. So the friendship between Magneto and Professor X is one of my favourite friendships and relationships in literature, actually. I think the idea of these two men and the enduring friendship they have, and then how they become enemies, and how they kind of dance in and out of the friendship and the antagonism, is a really interesting relationship. I mean, Professor Magneto is probably one of my favourite bad guys of all time. He's just so nuanced and so interesting. And when I looked at the Howl, obviously it's not a totally antagonistic thing, but the imagination I had around that was, well, what is the relationship between the Howl and the Alpha? Because there's a lot of potential tension in that relationship. If the Howl and the Alpha are at each other's throats, that's a huge amount of amazing drama and a messy relationship that's going to split the pack apart. So much interesting stuff an MC can do with that. But also, wouldn't it be more interesting if they were also friends? Because what's so wonderful and tragic and amazing about Professor X Magneto antagonism is because they're friends. And so I kind of say, in the kind of strapline, Howl is this kind of spiritual character. They, if you want to create stuff around an afterlife or rituals that you may do as a group to bind the pack and bind their spirits together, that's really fertile ground for the Howl player to play with. But also, think about your relationship with the alpha. Think about how that might look, and I would strongly encourage you to embrace both antagonism and friendship, because there's a really beautiful tension that you can bring out if you do that.
That's really cool. Yeah.
So that's it. That's all 7.
Cool.
That's
nice.
right. Yeah, I got it. I did it. I didn't forget
really cool.
any. Thank you.
So Bite Me is a game designed for sort of long-term, at least medium-term, long-term play. How does the characters and the pack evolve as you play? How do they change?
I think it all comes down to those messy relationships, actually. That's what changes things. There's just watching characters take shape over time and how their relationships change is just the most wonderful thing. And seeing people who start out in a very antagonistic mode patching up their friendship, because that's one of the great things that the spill moves can get you doing. Once you've had your catharsis, one of the most exciting things is not seeing people fall out. You start with people falling out, is watching them kind of patch up those relationships afterwards. I think that having the challenge move in there, challenge the alpha move, leads to a lot of really interesting things happen. I don't think I've never seen it done on a PC so far, but I've seen a lot of people doing it on NPCs, and the change that comes over somebody when they give up their original playbook and take the alpha playbook, and how that changes play going forwards is really, really interesting. That's one of my favourite things to see happen, actually, and it happens a surprising amount. But also, I think that if you have a PC alpha, watching them kind of struggle with keeping the pack together and protecting them, I think that's one of the things I would say about playing the PC alpha. If you think that is just going to be about shouting at other people and getting them to do what you want, think again. That playbook is a playbook which requires you to take on quite a mental burden of responsibility, out of character to a certain extent. People will look to you for leadership and guidance, and those are not necessarily easy or comfortable things to sit with. And so I think that actually having that playbook in there is particularly interesting. So I think that one of the things that comes out is that what happens to the alpha, who's alpha, and how that changes them is one of the most interesting things I've seen happen. But also, like I say, watching people patching up relationships that were broken and how they do that and how they move on is another interesting thing, because that's not a thing that we do a lot of in our role-playing games. We might have tense or antagonistic relationships, but we don't do a huge amount of role-playing in the space of mending those relationships and moving forwards and what that looks like. And I've seen a lot of that developing in some of the Bite Me games, because it says that although there are player versus player moves, you are a pack, you are a family. You're going to have to come together to defeat that threat. There's always something in the pack that you feel is worth saving. And so it gives people kind of the impetus to come back round to those relationships and work out how they're going to fix them. And that's some really interesting role-playing to do in that space.
Yeah,
I think so anyway.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it deals with a lot of stuff that many games don't address, or even a lot of fiction, to be honest. And one of the things, like, I love Monster Hearts, but it's kind of, I really wish there were more games like that, but that address things that are relevant to me now, that I'm not a teenager anymore. Like,
yes.
I want the midlife, like the midlife crisis role playing game. The oh my god, I'm about to be 30 years old. What I'm going to do with my life, kind of role playing game. And I really want to see more games explore that space. So kind of finishing the last couple of questions, and people in the chat, if you have any question, now's your moment. Any other question? What to kind of learn a little bit about your design process, so we can learn from it as well. What's some issue you found while developing the game, and how did you approach it and fix it?
Oh gosh, well, very early bits of the game didn't have a give in to the wolf move. And then I thought about that and I fixed that quite quickly. And that seemed like a huge oversight on my part. But I think originally I didn't actually put sex moves in. And I think that was a mistake. And that was a mistake that I rectified. And the reason I put those in is, well, partly because, and I've said this loads of times, so people are probably sick of me saying it by now, but in our world, tabletop role-playing games, what gets mechanized gets done. If you have 30 pages of weapons in your A4 D&D manual, then you have a hammer and every problem is a nail, or you have a sword and every problem is somebody's head who needs to be cut off. So if we don't put these things in our games, people won't think to do them. Because let's be honest, you know, when you're in a tight situation and your back is against the wall in character, you are going to look through your basic move sheet, you're going to look through your character sheet and your skins, your playbook, and see what's in your toolbox. So that's the first thing. If you don't have them, then people can't do it.
Yeah, in the end mechanics, player mechanics are ways that allow players to have reliable agency over the story, the world. So it's something they can hold on to.
Exactly. So by putting sex moves in, we're saying that we are allowing for a different sort of story or another type of story in addition to the ones we've already got. But the other reason, and I don't know why I didn't put them in the first time around, was this is a game about messy relationships, and sex messes up relationships. It changes relationships. It changes how people feel about them. It makes stakes a lot higher in relationships than perhaps they were previously. Whether it's right or wrong that sex does that, let's not pretend that in our culture it doesn't do that. So if it does do that, putting those in there, giving people the ability to tweak the story in really interesting, messy ways from this new angle, was something that I just kicked myself when I realized I hadn't done it, and I put them back in. I put them in. But you'll notice if you read the sex moves, they are all about making things more complicated between the characters. So the alpha sex move is that the packmate they have sex with is allowed to dominate them if they use heart. If they use their emotional leverage, not kind of the traditional aggressive dominance that you might think of, but if they use their emotional leverage to get the alpha to do what they want, then they are allowed to dominate them. The Howl has a thing in their sex move which says, now that you've had sex with this person, they're important to you, you'll get a +2 forward when you put them in danger to save the pack. The Cub's sex move starts to give them bonuses to taking action to save other people. So previously the Cub is somebody who they get a free pass, they get out of trouble. When the Cub has sex with another character, that changes who they are. That allows them to start becoming more of a protector and less of a protected. So the sex moves are in there to make those relationships more interesting and to change how characters are and how they're reacting. And I didn't do that the first time around, and that was a stupid thing, and I changed it.
That's really cool. And I had forgotten to talk about this, so it was really cool to bring them back. And lastly, according to the chat, they don't have any questions because you are explaining everything so well. So could you tell us a cool short story from something that happened while playing the game, some from the fiction or something like that you really just comes to mind, or you think represents the game well, or really whatever?
So there was a really, really nice moment in the game that I'm playing with my home group at the moment, where there's an alpha, there's an NPC enforcer, and there's a fixer. And the fixer had gotten married to a human and had not told anybody. And then for various different fictional reasons, a body needed to be disappeared, and the fixer called in a favour from their husband to come and disappear the body, which meant the husband turned up. The secret was blown open wide. There was a rule in the pack that all relationships with humans had to be disposable. And that was a pack tradition, and that pack tradition is a mechanical thing that basically that functions as like a inviolable law. So there will be serious consequences for breaking traditions. It's the sort of thing that could get you banished or killed or something. And so there was just a really nice moment. A series of hard moves kicked off. I think what happened, the fixer had rolled some misses, some hard moves kicked off. And so I, as the MC, said, okay, well, your husband's going to turn up and it's going to become pretty clear to everybody what's been going on. So lean into that drama. And there was just a really, really nice moment from the player playing the alpha, which I really loved, which was that when all of the other PCs had left the scene, he held the NPC enforcer back and asked her to kill the husband. Because the husband had learned the secret. The husband had learned that they were all werewolves, and their secret was exposed, and the pack was exposed. And I think what I loved about that was that was a really hard, dramatic thing for the alpha to do. There are a lot of players who I think would have found doing that quite a hard decision to make, because you know that you're going to be storing up some real drama with that player down the line when it all comes out, because it's going to all come out, isn't it? Because that's the point of a secret, is to dramatically throw it in people's faces, right? That's why we have secrets in role-playing games. But it was just a really, really lovely moment seeing this player take that decision of saying, okay, well, I'm going to bank this drama for further down the road. I'm going to have this person killed because I need to do it to protect the pack. And I know that later on there's going to be a massive amount of spilling and provoking spill and drama going on, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it was just, he just did it in this really nice, understated way. And I really enjoyed that.
That's really cool. That sounds really, really amazing. Okay, so I think this is going to be it for us. So yeah, I encourage all of you to go and check out Bite Me on Kickstarter. It's still, I mean, you may be seeing this in the future, but just to have a little a window of time to back it now, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it later as well. Also, if you want to, I will leave all the links in the chat and in the description on the YouTube video, so you'll be able to find it there. Yeah, if you also want to support Hijos del Rol, StoryAlways, you can, of course, share the video around, subscribe on Twitch and YouTube, become I don't know, I think it's also called subscriber, where you pay monthly on Twitch if you want to really support us, or if you are not more of like a one night stand kind of person, you can give us like a one-time donation through Coffee. That's perfectly fine. I'm open to those kind of relationships as well. So yeah, thanks a lot, Becky, for coming here. I'm really excited for the game. I really hope it does really well. So yeah, and thanks everyone for being here, and I hope you enjoyed this as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. I'll see you all soon. To the next time. Bye.